Hi everyone, my name is Han Yang. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The Devil's Advocate. Today's program will be my interview with Mr. Robert Barwick, the Research Director at Australian Citizens Party and its recent Senate candidate in Victoria. Thank you, Robert, for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Han.
No problem. Perhaps let's start by you giving us a brief introduction to yourself and the Citizen Party.
I'm Robert Barwick. I'm the Research Director of an Australian political party, the Citizens Party, Australian Citizens Party. We're a party that's been around for 37 years. We want Australia's economy to improve. We want sovereignty for our country. So we advocate policies that we think will give the Australian people better economic services, such as a public bank that will be able to be used by the government for long-term investments in the things that the public needs. And that's a policy that we're most known for. We also want Australia to be more independent on the global stage. We think we're too close to the United States and the United Kingdom. And in thinking that way, we're not alone. Some great Australian statesmen, such as the late Malcolm Fraser, thought the same. In fact, he was a friend of mine. And we think that as part of that, we should have a better relationship with China than we do, because China is very important to Australia's economy. And right now, and for a long time, it's getting better, but for a long time, we believe we were doing the United States bidding to be insulting to our best trading partner, not in our interest, but in the interests of our great and powerful allies. So we want to change that. I personally have been in politics for 30 years. I was someone that, as a young person, was a victim of the recession of the early 1990s, the recession that we had to have. I never had positive feelings about Paul Keating until recent years, Han.
Okay.
But we all blame Paul Keating for that economic recession. And that got me into politics and thinking about what you need to do to run an economy better. And I've been involved in the Citizens Party ever since.
All right. How did you go with the recent election at the Victorian Senate election?
Well, we grew our vote, but not enough. And overall, our national vote grew as well, but nowhere near enough to be a contender. We went into this election with a two-election strategy in mind, because one of the things that we're very conscious of, when you're involved in politics, you can kind of be in an echo chamber where you're saturated with your ideas and the feedback you're getting from the public who do know about you, and it seems very positive. But we have compulsory voting in Australia, and a lot of people vote who pay no attention to politics at all, and so we're not very well recognised out there in the community enough to actually be serious contenders at election. So we approached this election to build our vote and build our recognition, especially with a view to continue to do that towards the next election. So I'll probably end up with about, I think I'm over 8,000 votes now in Victoria for the Victorian Senate, and maybe 10 or 12, something like that. Not quite sure. But to get elected, I need about 500,000. So that gives you a sense of how well we did.
It's still a long way to go.
Yes.
The Citizen Party was linked to the Larouche movement in the US. Are there still any connections of any sorts now?
No, we haven't had the association with Larouche for 10 years, since 2015, and Lyndon Larouche himself died in 2019. So there is no connection with Larouche anymore. We did have a connection with Larouche for a couple of decades, though, which was an important learning experience for our party, because it did give us a perspective on international politics more than just looking at domestic politics, because that's one of the Larouche copped a lot of unfair criticism. He was very severely criticised in the mainstream media a lot, but he spent a lot of his time thinking about what it took to raise living standards in the third world and developing countries, how the great powers of the world should work together to build up the economic strength of the world, and that in a way that all people can benefit from. That what they were actually his bread and butter issues, and that by associating with Larouche, we got to see the world like that, rather than just look at politics from inside Australia and think everything that's happening here is entirely locally generated, because often it's not. There are big global shifts that happen that influence the domestic politics of each country.
Some of the mainstream media described Mr. Larouche as a conspiracy theorist. Would you agree with that characterization?
I think that's unfair. It's unfair for this reason. The mainstream media have a bias against people asking questions that they don't approve of. There's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world. There's a lot of there's a distortion of the media, in my view, because I call it the mainstream corporate media. It's especially in a country like Australia and in America, etc. We're told this is the free and independent media, when in fact these are owned by a handful of very powerful corporations. You do not get covered in that media unless if you're any kind of threat to the interests of those corporations. They're just as known for what they cover up as what they actually publish. And the journalists who work, there's a lot of ex-journalists who work for the mainstream media who come out and say, yeah, we were gagged. So one of the ways they gag people is to accuse them of being conspiracy theorists just for asking questions. Now, that said, there are such things as conspiracy theories that get completely wild and are ridiculous. I understand that. But you got to be able to ask the questions, but you got to look for evidence. You got to actually back it up with evidence. And that's where I think by and large, I won't defend everything Lyndon Larouche ever said, but by and large, that characterization is mostly unfair.
He was jailed for a few years for, I believe, for fraud or charges. Do you agree that the charge was fair? The conviction was fair?
Absolutely not. I agree with Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, who became Lyndon Larouche's lawyer. Ramsey Clark was a very famous civil rights lawyer in America. He there's a what's it called? There's a recent Netflix film called The Chicago 7, I think, about the people arrested at the time of the Democratic Convention in 1968, and you can see the character of Ramsey Clark there as the Attorney General, who plays a role in making sure they got just treatment. So in the early 90s, he was Lyndon Larouche's lawyer, and he described what happened to Larouche as the worst case of government misconduct he had ever seen. Because the fraud, there's a very simple explanation for the fraud charges. Lyndon Larouche had publishing companies, and some of those companies had loans with supporters. The American government put those companies into involuntary bankruptcy, and then in involuntary bankruptcy, they couldn't repay their loans. So this wasn't voluntary bankruptcy, it was involuntary bankruptcy. Then they couldn't pay their loans, and when they couldn't pay their loans, people like Larouche and his colleagues were charged with fraud for brokering those loans in the first place because they couldn't repay them. It's essentially securities fraud and mail fraud. And when it first went to trial in Boston, I know this very well because we were very closely associated with Larouche in the 90s. When it first went to trial in Boston, the judge in Boston threw it out. That should have been enough, but in breach of double jeopardy, the US government took the case to a court in Virginia, right where the CIA is headquartered, where the jury was literally full of US government employees, where Julian Assange would have gone if he had have been extradited to America. That he would have gone through that exact same court where they could rig the trials, and Larouche was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years, and he ended up serving 5 of those 15 years.
Okay, let's move on. So the leader of your party is still Craig Isherwood. How do you pronounce it? Isherwood?
Isherwood.
Okay.
Isherwood.
So I've seen his writing that he's reject the mainstream scientific understanding of climate change. Is that the official position of your party on the issue of climate change?
Well, we do believe there's a debate to be had on climate change, but if you look at our actual policies and what we've taken to recent elections, that's a more fair reflection of the party than what's in Wikipedia. Wikipedia was written by our political enemies, actually, Han, and after many years, I'm in the process of trying to change what's in Wikipedia because everything is spun. If you look at the debate about climate change, what we say is, look, there's a political and media reporting of so-called climate change, and then there's a scientific debate, and there's a big difference between the two. And we think all scientific debates should be allowed to be held and discussed, and people can work out what the actual proper position is here. A lot of this is highly speculative.
What is your position or your party's position actually on the climate change? Is that subject to debate?
Our main position is there is a debate which people shouldn't deny that there's a debate. We reject the idea that there's a totally complete and consensus on this. There's political claims of consensus, but we're happy for the international government processes to be held. And if you look at countries like China and India, who participate in those international fora on climate change, if you just look at their policies, by Australian political standards, they'd all be called climate change deniers. But they're not. They accept climate change, except they have a very rational approach to dealing with it, and they will not allow their economies to be undermined by political demands for action that are completely unrealistic in terms of net zero, etc. So, and if countries like China and India are doing it at their own pace, and by the way, just a quick aside, NASA, when NASA does their assess photos of the whole planet, they've in recent years recorded a greening planet. There's more greenery in the planet now than there ever has been. It's been increasing. And it's mainly been increasing in China and India, the two countries that have been pariahs in the global climate change forums for the last 20 years, even though they're just saying, look, we will deal with this as we need to. We will deal with this in a rational way that doesn't undermine our economies. What we argue here is, in Australia, what we've done in the name of climate change has well and truly undermined our economy because we've got enormously high electricity costs now. That's not all climate change action. Some of it is because of privatisation. There was a fanatical push for privatisation in the 90s. So now we have much more profit being made out of electricity. But a big chunk of it is so-called action on climate change, which is crushing families with electricity bills. And if we had taken a more measured approach, Australians would be better off.
So what's your party's solution to the issue you just raised about, let's say, electricity bills? Nationalize the power companies?
Renationalize the power companies. What we should, if you look at the recent elections, one of our criticisms as a party is there's too much corporate interest on all sides. So, for instance, you've got this phenomenon now where there's a breakaway from the coalition called the Teals, and the Teals have broken away from the coalition because they want action on climate change, they say. But those Teals are backed by big money. They also get public donations, I know, but those donations are matched by big money from people who are renewable energy investors. Now, we're supposed to believe, because they're investors in renewable energy, they're the good rich guys. And the people who own coal assets, they're the bad rich guys. We argue, no. If people are arguing a position that's from which they intend to make a profit, that distorts the whole process. If you want if climate change needs to be addressed, the most rational way to do it is renationalize all electricity and then get the engineers and say, here's the target, net zero or whatever it might be, come up with the best technology to get there, and we'll invest in it using public funds, such as in institutions like a public bank, which is the way we used to build our electricity anyway. For decades and decades and decades, we had the cheapest electricity in the world, not just because the coal was so plentiful, but because the way we built it was built by governments making long-term investments, not to try and make massive profits. And they would amortize the investments over the life of those investments to pay back the money that they spent, they would often raise in bonds or use the National Bank to fund. And in doing so, they would only charge the public what it took to cover the cost of repaying the debt, that long-term debt on those assets. And our electricity was very, very cheap. So let the engineers, we'll say we can fund it that way, but let the engineers figure out the best technology. Because I would argue, our party would argue that if you let them do that, we would also probably go nuclear, go down the path of nuclear power, because one power station is much more productive at producing electricity than acres and acres and acres and acres and acres of solar panels and windmills. There's a role for those things, but you need to be constantly increasing the energy density of your sources of power. And nuclear is an increase in energy density, whereas solar and windmills are very much a step backwards in terms of energy density.
So you are a supporter of nuclear energy?
Absolutely. In fact, unlike the Liberal Party, we're not opportunists. We spent many, many years, when nobody else would talk about it, educating Australians as to how nuclear energy works, how the technology actually works, how the safety systems work, how the waste can be dealt with, etc. And I think we played a role in reducing the fear that even allowed this debate to happen. Unfortunately, I think now that the Liberals have lost, they are opportunists and they'll probably end up dropping their policy. And it won't come back for a long time, but we will continue to argue that people need to look at, we're probably the only country in the world, or one of a tiny handful of countries in the world, that ban nuclear power. There's so many other countries in the world are making great strides in going ahead with nuclear power. I noticed one exception is Spain. Spain still has a policy of shutting down its nuclear power, even though Spain doesn't want to own up to what happened with its very renewables dense electricity system the other day. So that's their business if they want to do that. But we think we should go down the nuclear path. Yes.
Well, I guess I partially agree with you on this issue. I think at least I'm happy to have a debate on the nuclear power plant. It's given a lot of industrialized countries do have them, and they have successfully controlled the safety problems. Okay, so
I think just if I can just interject before we go on, I actually get embarrassed by how immature Australia's political debates often are, because you'll have, just say, Mr. Albanese, because he took a position against nuclear power and attacked Mr. Dutton for it. And he had a really good line. I mean, politicians are always looking for a soundbite. And he had a really good line about it, which is that, there was a famous saying from an old Labor leader going back decades, calling the Labor Party the light on the hill. And he said, "We are the light on the hill. You want us to glow in the dark." And that's a good line, but it doesn't, that's not a debate, right? That's not a debate. And when he's attacking Mr. Dutton in these vicious terms, as if Mr. Dutton is completely irrational for putting up nuclear power, it's actually an indirect insult to all of our major allies who all have nuclear power. And I'm thinking, this is really embarrassing, but they just want to keep the debate dumbed down so it's how it resonates in Australia. Anyway, this is not one of our core issues. It's something we do like to educate people about. But for instance, in this latest election campaign, because the Liberals had made nuclear power such a big part of their policy, we didn't even campaign on it, except to have a policy that said remove the ban on nuclear power and once you remove that, then just see what happens to it as a technology.
Okay, next question. Mr. Isherwood also claimed that the Indigenous land rights issue are a deliberate plan by the British monarchy to restrict economic development of Australia and depopulating the planet. Can you clarify that?
Well, that's probably, in terms of land rights, that's not something that we would say today. That was at the time that was based on the uncertainty over the implications of the Mabo decision. And there was a lot of uncertainty. And as a party, we had a lot of farmers who were our supporters. And it was unclear what that meant for their property rights, etc. Where we singled out where we singled out Prince Philip is there's a we're Republicans, so we don't like the Royals anyway, but there is a history to the environmental movement that goes back to Prince Philip and some of his cronies in 1960 starting the Worldwide Fund for Nature to save the panda and save the rhino and save the elephant and this sort of stuff. And they brought in a lot of big corporate money into creating an environmental movement. And they also started sponsoring, in some places, Indigenous movements. But we don't consider anything they did was genuine, because then you look at the contradictions to what they did, and this is all well documented. You look at, say, Africa and the role of the World Wildlife Fund and Prince Philip's partner, Nicholas Huxley, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and the way they cleared out African tribes from their historical land just to create these big nature preserves. And then for decades, even until, say, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, you know, a lot of the European royals, I don't know if you know, they're all related to each other. And a lot of them became office holders in the World Wildlife Fund, but they like going to Africa and hunting elephants. And so you can see a famous photo of King Juan Carlos of Spain with the elephant that he's just shot. So they cleared out the natives from these lands. They created these big nature preserves. And then as the elephants overpopulated, they had the right to go down there and do trophy hunting of these elephants. And it was all really hypocritical entirely. And anyway, there was a lot of this started coming out in the early 90s, and we published information about this. So that's why we were talking about Prince Philip and the role of an ungenuine promotion of Indigenous movements that we didn't consider genuine at all. Rio Tinto, as a company in Australia, was a big early sponsor. They tried to attach themselves to the land rights movement as a sponsor, even to the extent that there was a famous walk across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the early 2000s, the Sorry Walk, where thousands of people walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge to say sorry. And Rio Tinto was the sponsor of that walk. Now, I don't know if you should know this, but a few years ago, Rio Tinto showed its true colours when it came to Aboriginals by blowing up the Yukon Gorge in South Australia, a truly historical Aboriginal site, and they didn't care. So it's that kind of, when we see corporate role in this sort of stuff, we get very cynical, and we're exposing the things that we knew about that. But just back to the Aboriginal land rights question, the actual fact of it is that Mabo was always going to happen as a decision, because terra nullius, which was the legal doctrine that Mabo overturned, was a lie. It was an out-and-out lie. Captain Cook claimed Australia based on a lie, and that had to be overturned. And once it was overturned, then there were legal consequences. And now we can see that that's been playing out in the legal system ever since. And that's our position on that now.
What's your party's position on the Voice Referendum last year?
I was sympathetic to the sentiment, but it soon became clear it was oversold. What they were trying to do was an impossibility. On the one hand, they were saying that to reassure the public, they were saying the Voice would have no power. And on the other hand, they were saying that the Voice would close the gap. In other words, do something that had never been accomplished before. And both things couldn't be true at once. And as this became an issue, right-wing political voices rose up, and it was easy pickings for them in a sense. But I think fundamentally that's why. And what I would argue, our party, on an issue like this, our party didn't take a position. We left it up to our members, because it was a referendum. They all got to have a vote in it. We left it up to our members to weigh up the arguments and decide for themselves. But whenever anyone asked me, my argument was, well, you can take one or two approaches. You can acknowledge that the Aboriginals' existence was denied in the original Constitution, which was a British Act of Parliament anyway. Which it wasn't. The original Constitution was not the Constitution of a sovereign government. It was a British Act of Parliament to give us self-government as a self-governing colony. That's what it says. You can go and read it. And it ignored the existence of Aboriginals. So you can say, well, that was bad. Let's now attach Aboriginals to this existing Constitution, which still has, even if we have recognition for Aboriginals in this existing Constitution, those Aboriginals will still be under the sovereignty of a foreign power, namely the British Crown. Whereas the original sin was the founding of Australia that excluded the original inhabitants. Let's actually found Australia properly. We are Republicans. I mean, again, that's a core position of a lot of the original members of the Citizens Party. People can be part of our party and not be Republicans. That's not the point. But for those of us who are, we are Republicans, and we believe Australia should become a republic, and all the occupants of Australia should have a role in forming that republic, including the original inhabitants of Australia, the original occupants, and then everyone would have ownership of that. And going forward, that would be and we could even do it on a different day than January 26th, Han, to create a new Australia Day, right? And going forward, that would more fundamentally represent everybody than just attaching.
What day do you have in mind?
No, I don't. No. Whatever. The day that whatever constitutional convention it requires puts down the pen and says, okay, here's the date for the referendum. Pick one other than January 26th, please. Whatever date it is, pick one. And if it passes, that becomes Australia Day. That's all I'm saying. And look, I did talk to some of the leaders of the Voice campaign during the campaign, and I did ask one of them about what's more beneficial, symbolism or practical action. Now, his reply was, what's wrong with symbolism? And I didn't dismiss that out of hand, because I can tell you, white Anglo-Australians love their symbolism. Whenever we love glorifying the crown and all that kind of stuff, and we need to be thoughtful about this and self-conscious about how we do operate as white Anglo-Australians. So we shouldn't be dismissive of symbolism outright. But that said, Australia's Aboriginal population need a lot of practical solutions for their issues. And to me, that was not going to be provided by the Voice.
The Australian voters voted overwhelmingly against the referendum, and at last week's election, they overwhelmingly rejected the Liberal Party again as well. How do you explain the contradiction?
Oh, well, because one doesn't follow the other. It's much harder to change the constitution in Australia than to win an election. So I think there's been only 8 successful constitutional changes in Australian history out of over 40 constitutional referenda. People can get very nervous about what these changes mean, what the knock-on effects, what the unintended consequences are. And so the only ones that have won is when both parties are on the same page. Both of the major parties are on the same page. And that's all. And I actually agree with the criticism of Albanese. Once he knew he didn't have the support of Peter Dutton, he should have dropped it. And he should have lived. He still would have won this election, but he should have not tarnished the goals of what he was trying to do by pushing ahead with a referendum that in history would never have passed. Had nothing to do with the outlook of us. Close to 70% of Australians are not anti-Aboriginal. But once they got into the discussion and one party was making all these comments about it, they just got too nervous to go with the change. The election, on the other hand, is a different thing. The election is not that great an endorsement in fact, you could argue, Han, that the people who voted for the Voice were also the people who might have voted for Albanese, because he only got 35% of the vote. More people voted for the Voice than voted for Albanese. But with preferences, when it came down to the preferences, when people were making that second choice, they overwhelmingly voted against Peter Dutton, because Peter Dutton is I think, a one-dimensional politician. I agree with Malcolm Turnbull that he's a thug. His whole political career, he's associated himself with being a tough guy, being a hard man, taking cruel decisions on against people, decisions that I would argue are cruel. He reveled in it. He was the biggest chest beater in Australia to talk about a possible war with China. You would be aware of that. Anzac Day 2022, right? We must prepare for war. Those were his exact words. And yeah. People say, of course, you got to achieve peace, you got to prepare for war. Yeah, rubbish. That wasn't. Australian politicians hadn't talked like that for years. He was chest beating for war. People like him are the reason we have the AUKUS deal, and he couldn't be broadened out to be more appealing than that. He tried to, but in this election, the minute he got a chance to pounce on the China issue again, he couldn't help himself. Bang, he's on it. And that that sealed his fate, I think.
Well, the hard right faction in the Liberal Party said that Dutton's loss proved that he's not conservative enough, and the moderate faction said his loss meant that he was too conservative. Which side do you agree with?
Neither. They all they're all arguing out of self-interest. The reason I'm in this party is because I think it's a pox on both their houses. What's happening in Australia, in my view, you can go back, say 3 decades, and before that, what you'll find, and we weren't perfect then as a country at all, but I'll give you some comparisons. You'll find that the average politician of both parties, even though we were always in alliance with America, the average politician was thought more independently. It wasn't an automatic thing that we would always go along with America on things. You would find the average politician spoke better. And what I mean by that is they didn't sound like robots. They could actually convey ideas to the Australian public. Some people would blame that on the media cycle and social media and all that. But I think it was a fundamental. Well, the average parties were more representative of their members and the community than they are now. What's happened over the past 2 or 3 decades is the parties have got increasingly smaller. They only represent the vested interests who fund them. And so they're very much corporatized entities that only throw up as leaders machine politicians. And inside that, they have factions, and they'll call themselves, hard right, moderate, and whatever. But those are factions not based on fundamental philosophical differences mostly. They're just factions based on grasping for power. And they're trying to make sense of losing so much support. But if I was in the Labor Party, I don't count the 90 seats you might have. You need to count the fact you couldn't get to 35% of the vote and to win those seats. And you need to be, because those 90 seats can vanish like that because it's based on 35% of the vote. And they need to do their own soul searching about this. And the problem is they won't. And a lot of this fighting is as a distraction from actual soul searching. They need to go back to being truly representative of the public. And they're not going to, because that would mean breaking with the corporate interests who fund them. And so they come up with these debates that I think aren't worth anything. They need to fundamentally change, and they won't. And while that happens, they'll keep losing primary vote, and eventually other parties will come in and replace them, although that's very difficult because of our preference system. If they don't change, it'll happen inevitably.
Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. You mentioned that your party opposes AUKUS, but this is a bipartisan plan supported by both the Liberals and the Labour. So it's going to stay, the AUKUS is going to stay here, don't you think?
Well, that's their intention at the moment, but that doesn't mean it's going to work. We want to get an inquiry into AUKUS. That was being talked about during the election campaign, including by some of the Teals supported that. We want to get an inquiry into AUKUS so we can actually look at this thing, because think about the origins of AUKUS. Han, we had a Prime Minister in Scott Morrison who went from, in June 2019, saying Australia welcomes Belt and Road for the positive contributions it can make to the regional economy. That's what he said in June 2019. Less than a year later, he was deliberately and consciously being as insulting to China, our best trading partner, as he could be. He got off the phone from Donald Trump and made a demand that no other major country in the world would ever accept, which was for an inquiry into the origins of COVID, where we could send in investigators with UN weapons inspectors powers. This was deliberately calculated to be insulting. He completely attached Australia to the United States. He was a religious nutcase. And I'm going to get a bit excited here because I think he was very, very dangerous to our country. He was a religious nutcase who allied with another religious nutcase in Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, and these people are religious nutcases. And I come from that background, so that's my position. I'm going to call them that. They don't mind causing Armageddon because they think that'll bring Jesus back to earth. Mike Pompeo is itching to start a war over Taiwan, and he's been very open about it. He said if he won this election as president, he would tell Taiwan to declare independence. That's what he said. You and I know that's a red line for war. So that's the sort of person that Scott Morrison allied with. He secretly negotiated AUKUS with Pompeo and with Boris Johnson, the biggest buffoon in the history of British politics, an absolute embarrassment of a human being. So these three clowns conjured up this thing, and then he called up Anthony Albanese 6 months before an election, and he said to Anthony Albanese, here's what I've negotiated. You have 24 hours to agree to this. And he put Anthony Albanese in the position that Paul Keating, a very experienced political operative, later criticised his cowardice for, because Anthony Albanese had to make a political calculation and was given an ultimatum to do it. If he didn't agree to AUKUS within 24 hours, he knew that Scott Morrison would accuse him of being weak on national security at a time when hysteria about China was sky high. And as you know, I saw the letter you wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald last week or the week before. You know I'm right. The hysteria, the war talk about China was right up here. And Mr. Albanese was too scared to be caught up in that. And so he agreed to this plan, which is a plan where we hand over more than $368 billion to two countries to supposedly invest in nuclear submarines that they are not obliged to deliver. And at any stage, if they pull out, which both countries and both governments are doing big inquiries saying, can we even deliver on this deal? At any stage, if they pull out, whether it's this year after we've spent $20 billion or in 15 years' time after we've spent $300 billion, if they pull out, we don't get our money back. So if the Australian public actually got to see this in the cold light of day, what this deal actually is, in an atmosphere where I think Anthony Albanese has, because he is a more measured person than Peter Dutton, he's now beaten an absolute nutcase in Scott Morrison and a thug in Peter Dutton. And he has, at a time when Australians are looking more positively towards China as a contrast to the erraticness of Trump and the tariffs, etc., whereas China is a reliable trading partner. If this was happening now, I doubt if AUKUS would get up. And that's why I think we need an inquiry. Let the Australian people look at it in the cold light of day, where there's less hysteria about China, and would we want to go to that investment? That's why we oppose it. And I think if we got to get that message out to the Australian people, they would oppose it too.
Does the Citizen Party support the US-Australia alliance?
Well, I did a debate with an American in 2020 when we were the only party speaking up in defense of the Australia-China relationship. And this was an American named Salvatore Babones of the United States Studies Center. And I started off that debate by actually saying that we are the most pro-American party in Australia. But what we mean by pro-American is we actually, and this understanding does go back to our association with Larouche back in the 90s, and an appreciation of American history, where we actually talk about there's a real America that came into being by defeating an empire, the British Empire, and establishing a sovereign nation-state republic with codified powers for the executive and a constitutional system. What we're dealing with America today, post-World War II America, has become the empire that it once fought. That's our view of it. So the alliance between John Curtin and Franklin Roosevelt was the high watermark of the US-Australia alliance. That was when the alliance actually stood for something that was profound. That's when we saved Australia by defeating the Japanese. What we have now is not that alliance, and the ANZUS Pact itself isn't even a real alliance anyway. All it is an obligation to consult. So in this current form, no. We think we should get rid of the US military presence in Australia altogether, get rid of Pine Gap. I'm with Malcolm Fraser on that. Malcolm Fraser was a hard man of Australian politics hand. He was the third longest serving Prime Minister at the second most dangerous time of the Cold War. He was as pro-American in his time as anybody. But his final gift to Australia was a book in 2014 called Dangerous Allies, where he described the United States and the United Kingdom as those dangerous allies. He he made the point that Australia has never been an independent country. We've always been subservient to the United Kingdom and now the United States. And he called for the closure of Pine Gap because Pine Gap not only makes us complicit in a lot of bad things that happen around the world, such as the US drone program, killing civilians in places like Pakistan and Yemen in the name of fighting terrorism. It makes us complicit in those things, but it also makes us a target in a war that we wouldn't naturally pick, but America might pick for us. And then because of Pine Gap being the single most important American installation outside of the United States, we would definitely be a target in that war. He called for the closure of Pine Gap. So that's what we would want as well. If we get rid of all those things, we can rebalance the relationship and actually see what it looks like. But right now, what we've got is not an alliance. We're just subservient to the world's biggest empire.
Well, Australia has only 25 million people, and we occupy a huge continent. How do we defend our continent if we're not in an alliance with a superpower?
Well, my answer is defend against whom? So I grew up in Queensland in the 1980s, and I was told that the Indonesians were going to invade us. Why would Indonesia invade Australia? Well, we make certain assumptions. This is a fear that Australians have, that certain interests have always preyed on Australians with, going back 150 years. The fear of we're a white country in Asia. Indonesia doesn't need our resources. They've got as many as us. They're an immensely rich country in terms of resources. They just need the development of them. They've never looked like invading Australia, and I don't believe they're a natural threat to Australia at all. Certainly not for the foreseeable future. And we should be in an alliance with them anyway, right? We could have a very good relationship with Indonesia. We talk about a good relationship with Indonesia, but it's actually a pretty pathetic one. Such as if you look at the way we treat Indonesia when it comes to visas, we treat them like dirt. It's very difficult for Indonesian people to even get tourist visas to come to Australia. That's pretty shabby, the way we treat Indonesia. So what's the other threat? Well, Japan's not a threat anymore. The one country that actually did try to invade us, no one would call Japan a threat. Though actually, if you look at the nature of the Japanese government, and especially the Japanese government under Abe, full of denialists of what Japan did in World War II, you could mount an argument that the nature of the Japanese government combined with the rearming that they've been allowed to do. I remember when I was a kid and read about how Germany and Japan were pacified after World War II. And I, as a child, like a 12-year-old or something, I felt immense relief because I knew what I knew of the history of World War II. These two very dangerous countries were now sworn to be pacifists. But in the name of these modern geopolitical conflicts, we've allowed them to rearm. And then you combine that with the nature of the Japanese government. I think if we're going to talk about a serious risk, we should be talking about that one. But I don't think it's a risk, but you could mount an argument. So then the other one is China, the biggest country in the world in terms of population. Is that a threat to Australia? That's what we're being told is a threat to Australia. But China is not a stupid country. China knows that invading and occupying a country is very expensive. It gets everything it wants from Australia by just buying it. That's its preferred way to do business. I talk to journalists in Australia who just assume that China would want to come and invade and take away all our resources. When at the moment, we're digging them up for them and shipping it out to them, and all they have to do is pay for it. And it's far less expensive. It doesn't cost treasure or blood than what a war would be. And they look at the United States over the last 20 years, and every indicator is they're not interested in that. So my question is, defend against whom? You need to have a defense policy. I get that. We're not pacifists. But with a defense policy, you need to have a much better engagement with your own region and be friends with these countries that otherwise we would be talked into thinking are a threat to us. And I think that's where our security lies. Australia could be the food bowl for Asia. We have immense potential here for that, and forge our relationships around those sorts of trade relationships.
Well, I agree that the so-called invasion of Australia, the scenario is way overblown. But a more realistic scenario is, I think, the only chance where the two superpowers, the US and China, engage in military conflict is over Taiwan, rather than the US invade China, because both sides are nuclear powers and nobody going to invade each other. So what do you think is this future scenario gonna happen over Taiwan?
Well, my understanding is that, and I think there's plenty of evidence for this. Taiwan is a country not a country. I'm not just saying that to be politically correct. Taiwan is not a country; it's a province of a country. But Taiwan is a place that has differing opinions about what they want their future to be, and it is in America's interest to keep Taiwan antagonistic to China and have an element in Taiwan talking about independence. Now, we're supposed to believe it's all done with just it's purely the agency of the Taiwanese people. Yeah.
So you don't think the Taiwanese people have agency on this issue themselves?
They have their own opinions, but I know how America works because I know how it works here. There are American interests in Taiwan stirring up the independence movement like crazy. There's the KMT, which is the party that actually fought the Civil War with the Communist Party. If left to their devices, there might have been some kind of unification by now under a one country, two systems model. So they're now the pro-China party, if you could call it that. And you've got this other element that American interests are helping to stir up. I accept they have their opinions, but when you consider that there is no longer the grave imbalance that used to exist, where Taiwan was an advanced industrial country with a high living standard and mainland China was very poor and backward. That was the reality for a long time, right? That doesn't exist anymore. Clearly, even Taiwan's own trade shows that China is its biggest and most important trading partner. And the natural exchange between the two would naturally lead to some kind of a resolution of this over time, if left to their devices. But there are people in America who look at the world and say, we need to have excuses to project power in these places. And I think if you take that element out of it, then it would be a bit different. From Australia's standpoint, this is quite important. This Taiwan question is quite important because if we don't watch ourselves, I've interviewed the former Deputy Ambassador to China in my channel, on the Citizens Party channel, quite a few times, John Lander. He draws comparisons between Australia and Ukraine. And just like the Ukraine war with Russia was from the beginning a proxy war with the United States and Russia, from the beginning, fully armed by the United States, using Ukraine as proxies, he fears that America would never directly engage with China because that would be too dangerous. It could lead to an escalation to nuclear war, and both sides would want to avoid that. But America would happily use proxies, whether it be Australia or a country like the Philippines, to provoke or to engage in such a conflict with America backing us up.
So you don't think Russia is the culprit of the Ukraine-Russia war? You think it's basically, if you say it's the proxy war, you're basically saying the United States is behind it.
The United States is the antagonist, not just behind it. It's the antagonist. It's between Russia and the United States.
Well, I think the Ukrainian people disagree. So what you're saying is Ukrainian people have no agency in this?
No. Some Ukrainian people would disagree, but the Ukrainian people who speak Russian, who since 2014 were being bombed by their own government for years, where the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's own figures by 2022 showed that there were 14,000 civilian deaths in the conflict before Russia entered into Ukraine since 2014. And of those 14,000 deaths, 80% were on the Russian-speaking side. In other words, the Ukrainian government was killing their own people. Now, if that was Saddam Hussein doing that, if that was Gaddafi doing that, or if that was Assad doing that, the media headlines in the West would be Assad is killing his own people, Libya is killing his own people. When it was the Ukrainian government doing that to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that was okay.
You don't think the Russian government were behind and stirring up troubles in those regions, just like you were accusing the United States stirring up troubles in Taiwan?
There weren't any troubles. There were not any troubles at all until American politicians went to the Euromaidan and handed out bread to cash in on what Victorian admitted was a $5 billion investment to get that outcome of a coup that overthrew a democratically elected government and replaced it with a puppet government of the United States. That's when the troubles actually started. And Ukraine was supposed to have a constitution that at the end of the Cold War included neutrality. And instead, Ukraine chose to attach itself to that side of Ukraine, full of, and forget the propaganda. I've been involved in it. Last year, I worked very hard with Jewish Ukrainian communities in Australia to expose the fact that the official Ukrainian community in Australia, the one that Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese endorsed, were actual Nazis. Stefan Romaniev was the head of a Nazi organization. He was an Australian. He was the global head of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalist Bandera. We gave him a state funeral. Jewish members of parliament attended that state funeral for an actual Nazi. And all that was whitewashed because of the pure propaganda in the way the Ukraine-Russia conflict was presented.
If you're saying that the Ukrainian side were the Nazis, explain to me why the neo-Nazis parties in the West, in the US, in Europe, they're all supporting Russia. How is that?
No. That's completely untrue. They're not all supporting Russia. In fact, Brenton Tarrant, the Australian Nazi who went to New Zealand and killed 50 people at the mosques in 2019, he had gone to Ukraine to hang out there for a while. On the Ukrainian side, there's plenty of Nazi movements around the world that are very much for the Ukrainian side. However, Western Nazis are nutcases, Han. They just get off on conflict and war and whatever. Who knows what's in their head? You don't judge a person by the mentality of everybody who admires them. A lot of them admire Donald Trump too. A lot of them, some idiots might admire Keir Starmer. I don't know, but that does not define the problem. The problem there's a saying: never ask a woman her age, never do whatever, never ask a Ukrainian what their grandfather was doing in World War II, because Western Ukraine is full of actual apologists for actual Nazis. You saw it. One of them, Zelensky went to the Canadian Parliament, and those damn fools are so full of their own propaganda. They got an actual Nazi Waffen SS member in his 90s to come, and everyone saluted him. And then, of course, it's just papered over with embarrassment. No, most of them went to Canada. A bunch of them came here. These are actual people who are allied with Hitler in World War II, which is in the history of the world of post-World War II. That's the worst thing you could possibly be unless you're a Ukrainian. So come on, this is how propaganda is fed to the public. And all I can tell you, go back and look at our website, get off Wikipedia, which was, by the way, our Wikipedia entry, which is full of twisted stuff about us, written by one of those Jewish politicians who went to that Nazi's funeral. His name is Michael Danby. He wrote our Wikipedia entry in 2005 originally. That's why it's been very hard to change it, because he's our enemy. He wrote it. In 2012, he was calling for regime change in China because he's an arch neoconservative. He's associated with the Henry Jackson Society in America. He would love us to go to war with China. This clown. He's an American agent. Actually, he's an apologist for everything the United States does. And he actually shamelessly attended the funeral of this Nazi last year, while Ukrainian Jews were begging me to get the message out to the world that a Nazi was being given a state funeral in Victoria. And I tried, and I put out press releases, and I spoke to all the media. Zero, zip, nada interest. I know you're a critic of China. You would tell me China has a controlled media, it's not free. Come and sit in my chair, walk in my boots, and see how the Australian media actually works.
Okay, let's move on to the last question, last topic. Is it fair to describe the Citizen Party as a Sinophile, pro-China party?
Yes. Yes, as far as it goes. Compared to other parties, yes. We admire China's economic progress. We value China as a trading partner to Australia. That's our position on China. And so if that makes us pro-China, then so be it.
Do you think China has human rights problems that need to be resolved, and especially in terms of press freedom?
No. I have a very dim view of the entire global narrative about human rights, mainly because I have, as someone who has spent his whole life in Australia, who I quoted Malcolm Fraser before. So in my lifetime, our country has gone from having a prime minister who was a hard man politically at the height of the Cold War, who welcomed in boat people, welcomed them in, Vietnamese refugees, and gave them comfort and a home, because that's how you treat human beings. And we went from that to 20 years later, governments who instituted the most deliberately cruel policies they could towards these human beings in order to create a deterrence against other desperate human beings from coming here. The Australia I grew up in would not have countenanced treating human beings that way. Now you can't get elected unless you're prepared to.
Okay, do you
So
okay
when our country talks about human rights in other places, I'm not interested. I want our country to get its Human Rights Act together, and this is true for our allies as well, the United States and Britain. They're all hypocrites when it comes to this stuff. Leave countries alone. Let them figure out their issues. You take the beam out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of someone else's.
So you just used our treatment of the refugees or asylum seekers as an example. Do you know that China actually deport all the North Korean refugees, asylum seekers back to North Korea?
Yeah, but China doesn't go around the world claiming to be the moral authority on human rights. We do.
Actually, I disagree. If you look at the Chinese constitution, all the propaganda put out by the Communist Party, they declare themselves as the paragon of human rights, of freedom, of democracy. Actually, the Chinese leadership call themselves the people's democracy. So I don't think.
But Han, I said go around. I said go around the world. Does China go and cast judgment on all the other countries of the world for their human rights standards? The only time it ever does is when it's getting back at a country like Australia, and that's just to make a political point. It does not go around casting judgment on all the countries of the world. We do. And if we're the ones that are going to go and cast judgment, we need to have our act together. Here's an irony for you. As you probably know, given that they claimed there was genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, genocide, yet the same people claim that what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, where every day you can see babies blown to bits, that's not a genocide, but there's genocide against the Uyghurs. There's not a flood of refugees around the world of Uyghurs to match the claim, but just say there was a flood of refugees out of Xinjiang, and because we're a country that claims to support human rights and we care about the Uyghurs, just say some of those refugees got on a boat and said, let's get to Australia. Do you know what we would do to them when they got here, Han? We would lock them up in a concentration camp on islands in the Pacific. That's what we would do to them.
Well, I think I half agree that the term genocide probably doesn't apply correctly here in the Xinjiang situation. I think the term has too much emotional baggage to actually unnecessarily complicated the whole issue. But I would rather point out, this is also from my personal interaction with many friends from Xinjiang. There are many of them living here in Australia. There is a dire situation for the indigenous population there in terms of political control, thought control, in the name of anti-terrorism. But okay, that's another topic we can discuss it next time.
You're gonna have me back?
Yeah, sure. We can have as much discussion as we can in the future. I've seen your social media post about the case of Daniel Dugan. Is it called Dugan or Duggan?
Duggan, yep.
And do you apply the same level of critical thinking on the issue in terms of, say, the Dr. Yang Hengjun, who was jailed in China on a suspended death sentence? I think there is a kind of a double standard here, especially, well, for example, for you and for a lot of people on the Australian left who were advocates for Julian Assange and for Duggan, but pretty quiet on Dr. Yang and previously on the other Chinese Australian lady who was released finally from Chinese jail last time.
My starting position is, as I said before, I criticize my government for what it does. Our media barely breathes a word about Dan Duggan, but they're all full of if China locks up somebody, we'll know about it in the Australian media.
Actually, I disagree. There are plenty of coverage of the Duggan case in Australian media.
Well, not coverage to actually advocate for him. the people that China locks up become cause célèbres. That doesn't happen here with Dan Duggan.
Well,
Dan
I think
Duggan,
there's a reason for that, because in Duggan's case, there were clear indictment, public release document indictment by the Department of Justice in the US, whether you agree with the charge or not, but the charges are clearly laid out there with the accusations. In the case of Dr. Yang and Miss Chen Lei, the charges are secret. To this day, we still don't know what the charge is about. And I think that's why we're calling for due
well,
process.
hang on. Cheng Lei knows what her charges are. She just doesn't want to talk about them.
Well, she talked about it later after she was released. She said she was breaking news embargoes. That's her alleged crime. And it's up to the Chinese government to refute her if they disagree with her statement on the issue. The Chinese government.
I disagree. I think you're misrepresenting that. Cheng Lei said, when she was the only time she was ever asked explicitly about this, she said about the embargo, but she wouldn't elaborate any further, because she also claimed that there may be some risk to her if she did, except she was already released back in Australia, absolutely no risk to her, and she doesn't want to elaborate on what the actual charges are. I have to question the fact that she got a job at the most virulently anti-China media outlet in Australia, so thoroughly virulent that its geriatric owner, Rupert Murdoch, was in COVID, when he was holed up in COVID. The emails have been released where he was telling his editors deliberately, attack China. So that's what the Sky News crowd did. They led these attacks on China, and they've employed her. That's up to her. I don't care. That's her business. The other man, Heng Yangjun, as you know, he worked for Chinese intelligence. Unlike Dan Duggan, who is much more of a clean skin, he worked for Chinese intelligence. He wrote books about being a double agent. He went to the United States, and other people involved in the intelligence world took him to the airport. He was warned against flying to China. I forget the name of the person who dropped him off, who was also connected to the CIA, a Chinese person in America connected to the CIA, dropped him off at the airport to catch his flight to China, and that's when he was arrested. Yes, it's a murky story, but I tell you what, the person at the center of it is an equally murky person. Dan Duggan is an American Top Gun who, like thousands of other ex-servicemen around the world, including in the United States, as a retired person, sold their skills to the private sector. And in his case, 2012, he goes to South Africa, and for a few months he helps to train Chinese pilots in South Africa. And you say that the legal process is all transparent and above board. No, it's a secret grand jury indictment. In other words, the grand jury process that produced the indictment is secret, from a government, the Trump administration, that had come to power with a genuine agenda to start escalating a conflict against China. China didn't pick that fight. The United States did. And they're making an example of one of their ex-citizens. And my main criticism, he's an Australian citizen. They're making an example of one of their ex-citizens to do it. So one of the journalists that I have great disrespect for in the Australian media is Peter Harcher. I agree with Paul Keating on Peter Harcher when he wrote the Red Alert headline about a Chinese invasion of Australia, blah, 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 back in 2023. But there's one thing Peter Harcher once wrote in 2022 or 2021 I agree with, which is that he made the point that when China does these things that we accuse it of doing, of cracking down on human rights and spying on the diaspora, etc., there's a lot of things that we accuse China of doing, human rights in Xinjiang, etc. What China's motive is to protect itself. Even he admitted this, Peter Harcher, protect itself against what it sees as operations to undermine China. China is not going around the world trying to undermine Australia, trying to overthrow the American government. There are not agencies in China dedicated to the overthrow of the American government, whereas there are agencies in the American government dedicated to the overthrow of China. And if we in the West just learn to mind our own damn business, then maybe some of these security measures that China feels it has to take, it will genuinely relax. and that's just not me saying it. I'm quoting people who have of high standing in the American military and foreign policy establishments with experience of many, many years, who are sort of the alternative commentary set, because they won't get in the mainstream media much, but it's people like Chaz Freeman, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the people with real credibility, because they were the ones who either opposed the crimes of like the Iraq War, or came out and blew the whistle on what happened, etc. These are the people saying it. They know how these operations work. China is not doing the equivalent to our countries. And maybe, just maybe, if we stop doing it to theirs, some of these security measures, which may be heavy-handed, I'm not here to defend that. That's China's business. But China's not my government, so I'm not here to criticize it either. I criticize my government. Maybe, just maybe, they'll be able to relax them at a certain point.
Well, interestingly, I think you criticize the United States and British a lot, but not the Chinese government.
Because they own our government. They're our allies, so they get their collateral damage. Han?
All right, understood. Okay, last question. You went to China. When was that? You went for a trip in China?
I didn't.
You didn't? Okay, I thought you.
I did a. Do you know Andrew Phelan?
No.
Oh, okay. No, I have been to China, but only in 2019, December 2019, it was a layover in Guangzhou on the way to Paris, and also a layover on the way back. I've never actually been in China proper.
Okay,
I'm hoping to go.
You're never been there? Okay.
No, I'm hoping to go later this year. My position on China.
I read your tweet. That one of the tweets you had is that you're asking everybody to go to China to see for themselves, but ironically, you didn't.
No, I haven't. Not I didn't. I haven't. I will. I should be able to get there later this year. I should have. People have been begging me to go for quite a few years now. It's just finding the time. I'm a busy guy, finding the time. But maybe in October I'll get to go to China. I'm in discussions with people how to do it. I was invited to China last year by the Chinese embassy and the Chinese government. There was a tour they put on for how would you say it, political parties around the world, to come to China. Now, unfortunately, our organisation had a major conference on that I was central to, so I couldn't go. We sent someone else in our place. It was an all expenses paid trip. We were the only ones to knock that back. We paid our own way, because we have not accepted a red cent from anybody associated with from the Chinese government, anybody associated with the Chinese government, anybody lives in like a Chinese citizen, etc. We do not take money for our position. Our position is a pro-Australian position. We want independence for Australia, but we just know that it is not in Australia's interest to have a war with China. So I think we agree on that. And we also take the view that there's actually, if you brush aside all the claims about China, you don't have to assume that it's perfect, but brush aside all the claims about China, and there's actually a lot to admire of its progress. And then when you drill down into some of those claims, you get to meet people who have been to China. And I've talked to people who've been to China and witnessed protests, ordinary citizens having a spontaneous protest against the government or the local government about something. And because they grew up in the West and they assumed that they were about to witness another Tiananmen Square massacre, they assumed they'd see police come along and shoot these people and throw them in a ditch because this is evil authoritarian China. And instead, one person told me this story about how a couple of little old ladies held up traffic because they were protesting something. And the police very patiently they could have lifted them off the road. They actually took 20 minutes to talk them into leaving the road. And this person who told me this story was just blown away because he just assumed that everything he'd been told about China and it's being heavy-handed, etc., was true. Now, you have a much more nuanced view than that, I know. But what you have to understand is, in a lot of Western minds, their view of China is a caricature. And all I'm trying I want to go to China and see it for myself, of course, but I don't have to go there to know they've made enormous progress. I see a lot of people reporting on that. But I also just want people to start treating China in their mind as a normal country. And if they can do that and be unbiased, then there might be grounds for constructive criticism, done out of goodwill. You know, there's always grounds for that kind of thing, but not when they're operating from a caricature in their mind that's been formed by just unfounded Western propaganda for decades.
Well, there'll be more topics to discuss in the future, I guess.
Sure.
All right.
Happy
Thanks very
to.
much.
Thanks, Anne.